Anne and her sister Joan were returning by car from their parents' house. John, Anne's husband, usually drove the car, but he was held up at work. Anne smiled at Joan and said, "I had to drive the Miata." Joan shook her head and said, "And where would we put all our stuff?" Anne loved her Miata convertible. She named the car Mary and was inseparable from her for 12 years. The car was both her parents' 18th birthday present and her high school graduation. Anne looked at Joan and said, "John and I always have only the essentials with us." At the traditional family reunion, everyone asked about John. Anne's father was especially disappointed that John couldn't make it. Anne and Joan were 2 of 5 daughters. Their father had no sons. That said, no one knew which of the sisters was the favorite daughter. But there was no doubt about who was his favorite son-in-law. John called and apologized, promising to visit them soon. John was tall, dark-haired, well-tanned, and handsome. He was also smart, loving, and funny. He worked in the distribution center of an international company in Fredericksburg, Virginia. They had been together since 9th grade. John and Anne attended colleges that were 200 miles apart but still stayed together. John always joked that they went to different colleges together. Anne looked out the window. She remembered all the kids asking about Uncle John. John loved the children, and they loved him. He was their favorite playmate at every family reunion. Joan looked at her sister. She felt something was bothering her. Finally, she said, "Okay, let's get it over with. What's going on with you?" Anne continued to stare out the window. Joan looked away from her for a few minutes, but then she told her sister again, "You'll feel better if you share what's bothering you with someone. You know you can tell me anything." Anne lowered her head and said, "I'm having an affair." Joan was shocked and fell silent. Coming to her senses, she asked, "Are you cheating on John? Oh my God, Anne, why?" Anne looked up with tears in her eyes and said, "I don't know why myself." Joan reached out to take her sister's hand. "Tell me everything," she asked. Anne answered, "It started 6 months ago, right after our family meeting. It was David Stevens from my office. He'd been flirting with me for a couple years, and one day I just said yes." Joan clarified, "Is this the same David Stevens I met at one of your picnics last year? The same David Stevens you warned me to stay away from? The man you called an asshole who chases every skirt?" "Yes," Anne said. "I thought I'd be safe from him. There's no way I could fall in love with someone like that." Joan asked, "But you fell in love with him?" Anne shook her head and said, "No, of course not. It's just that I used to think he was an asshole. Now I know that for a fact. I broke up with him on Friday at lunch." Joan looked at her sister. "It was lunch in a hotel room?" Anne looked angrily at Joan and said, "No, no, and no, it was in a restaurant." Joan asked, "You had sex with him, but you didn't like him? That doesn't make any sense, Anne. I have to ask again, why?" Anne hesitated for a moment, then answered, "I think I freaked out when I saw John playing with the kids 6 months ago. We were just discussing having children of our own. The house was almost paid off. Our cars are paid off. We have no credit card debt. Joan, we have almost $20,000 in a college fund for kids who weren't even born. We plan to really do it when we turn 30. John is 30 now. I'll be 30 in 2 months." Joan asked, "You don't want kids?" Anne replied, "I always thought I did. But now I'm scared. I've been afraid of becoming a mother. I'm afraid of losing us, me and John. I'm afraid of losing myself. I love my job. I should have given up the pills 6 months ago." "Anne, does John know all this?" Joan asked. Anne shook her head sadly. Then Joan asked another question. "You didn't give up the pills." Anne said quietly, "At first, I didn't want to stop taking them. After I started with David, I had to stay on them. I couldn't risk getting pregnant with him." Joan got angry. "You slept with him without condoms. You know his history. How could you not think about protection?" A weeping Anne said, "He doesn't like rubbers. I don't like them either." Joan said to her sister, "John thinks you haven't taken birth control in 6 months. You need to stop this madness. You need to tell John everything and beg his forgiveness. He loves you, Anne. He can forgive you, but only if you're honest and upfront with him. You know, John, a secret will kill your relationship." Anne replied, "No, Joan, I could never tell him. Do you remember Bob and Carol Wilson?" Joan nodded. Anne continued, "Bob was having an affair with someone from work. Carol found out, and their lives have been a living hell ever since. John and I had several conversations about Bob's infidelity. He couldn't understand how someone in love could cheat. I tried to defend Bob. I told John that if they really loved each other, they could save their marriage. I told him that they could put the pieces of their mosaic together. This affair might even make their marriage stronger. But Joan, I can tell you for a fact that he doesn't look at it that way. Joan continued to listen to her sister. She realized that Anne was just digging herself an ever deeper hole. She asked Anne, "Tell me about David Asshole Stevens. I can't believe that sex with him could be so unpleasant." Anne replied, "Sex with David is normal. He's aggressive in bed. But with David, everything was done hastily, and again, we never had much time to get together. With John, it's much better. It was always great." Reflecting aloud, Anne said, "I tried to make David more like John. Why would I do that when I already have John? Unfortunately, John was becoming more and more like David in bed. We haven't had all-day lovemaking in a couple months." Joan was disturbed by this news. She asked, "Anne, when did your sex life with John start to change? Was it around the same time you and John started discussing the Wilsons?" Anne hesitated. "I think so." Joan remarked, "The John I know doesn't like gossip, but I think he tried to get you to end your affair for the first 3 months, and for the last 3 months you've been defending your affair." The realization struck Anne. Oh God, no. Does he really know? Does John know about David? Anne picked up her cell phone. She needed to talk to John. She needed to hear his voice. The call went straight to voicemail. Joan asked, "How did he communicate with you when you talked to him last night?" Anne realized that John hadn't called last night. They always talked before going to bed. Even when they were separated by thousands of miles, they talked. Anne said to Joan, "He didn't call me last night." Joan asked, "Tell me about your last communication. Did he seem okay?" Anne replied, "He seemed normal. We talked about Bob and Carol again. Joan, he said it was too late for them. He said that if Bob had come clean, maybe he would have had a chance." Anne continued, "We talked about Mary, about my car. He asked me if I would fix it if the windshield cracked. I told him that of course I would. Then he asked me if I would fix it if I had fender damage. I told him yes. He then asked me, would I fix it if the car was totaled in an accident? I told him no. I remember telling him that the car would never be okay again. It might look new, but it would never drive like it used to. And he told me that Bob had ruined his marriage to Carol." Joan was crying now too. She said to Anne, "Pull yourself together. We don't know for sure what he knows, but we do know that you absolutely have to talk to him." Joan pushed a little harder on the gas pedal. They pulled into the driveway of Anne's house. There was a light on the front porch, but John's SUV wasn't there. Anne shouted fearfully, "He's not here!" Joan judiciously replied, "He could have parked in the garage. Open the garage door." Anne knew his car wouldn't be in the garage. Their 2-car garage was reserved for her Miata and his 1988 BMW 325C convertible. She used her cell phone to open the garage door. The two women looked at the nearly empty garage. John's convertible was not in the garage. Anne's Miata was gone, but there was something in its place. In the spot where the Miata had been parked before lay a 4-by-4-foot mound of mangled red metal. On top of it lay a large envelope of heavy paper. Anne knew the contents. She had prepared many such packages herself at her job. On top of the envelope was a metal emblem that read, Mary. That emblem had been on the back of her car when they replaced the Mazda emblem with Mary a few years ago. On one of the emblem's screws hung John's wedding ring. Next to the emblem were her birth control pills. Anne picked up a paper lying to the side. It was a handwritten note addressed to her. She read the short text. "Dear Anne, I'm sorry that everything I did wasn't enough for you. I hope you and David will be happy together. I just wanted you to respect me enough to tell me that to my face. Your Mary is that metal junk you see in the garage. Let me know if you can put the pieces of that mosaic back together again. I've always loved you, Anne, and I will always love you. I hope you find the happiness you're looking for in your life. John. R.S. You have some kind of STD. Please get yourself tested. Our doctor says it can be pretty nasty if left untreated. You need to see him on Monday. He says you will need to tell the health department about your lovers." Anne handed Joan the note and sat down on the floor. She couldn't cry. She couldn't make a sound. She couldn't move. Joan sat down beside her and held her tightly against her. Anne's cell phone rang. She answered it without looking at the caller ID. "John?" she cried. "No, it's your mother," came a voice from the phone. Her mother continued, "John just left us. He brought your father some parts for the car and said he came to say goodbye. He didn't want to tell us what happened. He said you should tell us yourself. Why is he leaving you, Anne?" Anne told her mother, "I had an affair. I slept with another man." Anne's mother was silent for a few moments. Then she said disappointedly, "I can't believe you could do something like that. Is Joan with you?" Anne replied, "Yes, Joan is here." Her mother then said, "I have to go. Your father needs me. Anne, he's crying. I've been married to him for 40 years, and this is only the second time in my life I've seen him cry." Joan helped Anne into bed. Anne got up in the night and went downstairs to sleep on the couch. She couldn't sleep in their bed without him. The two of them spent a restless night. The next morning, Anne was up and ready to face a new day. She took a shower and woke Joan up. Anne said, "I have a busy day today. Will you help me?" Anne knew her sister's answer. She thought about John. He had no real family to lean on. His parents had died in a car accident 20 years ago. He had one brother, but that one was in the military and they only saw each other once every couple years. The fact that he was facing this alone broke her heart. The sisters went from the house straight to the doctor's office. He asked the necessary questions as professionally as he could. Anne felt guilt in every answer she gave. The doctor wrote several prescriptions to treat her venereal disease. Then they went to Anne's workplace. She talked to James Johnson. He was the partner she worked most closely with. She told him the whole story. He told her to take a week's vacation. The firm would represent her in the divorce. He promised to solve any work problem while she was away. As she left Johnson's office, she headed down the hallway to where she saw David Stevens talking to a couple of paralegals. When he turned toward her, Anne kicked him in the groin with her knee. She picked up a heavy copy of Black's Law Dictionary and kicked him in the head. David Stevens flew across the table and landed with a clatter. Anne said, "Expect a call from the health department." Anne turned around and saw Mr. Johnson. She said to him, "I apologize for the mess. Will the firm represent me if I am arrested?" Johnson smiled and nodded, then said, "There will be no police report." Then they went to John's workplace. Anne knew that John had an automobile trailer and had taken all the possessions he had with him. He must have left the neighborhood, but she had to find him. She went to John's boss's office. Anne had met Fred Jennings at several company events. He was a good boss and a good man. His secretary was Doris Miller, the nurse of the company. Doris saw Anne and said, "Hi, Anne. Fred has been expecting you. Please come in and have a seat." Anne saw the sadness in her eyes. Anne and Joan entered Fred Jennings' office and sat down in the chairs offered to them. Anne aggressively said, "I need to know where John is. Does he still work here?" Fred calmly replied, "Anne, you have no enemies here. I've always liked you, and I think very highly of John. He said you could come here. He authorized me to answer all your questions." Fred continued, "John has moved to Charleston, Scotland. He's the new Southeast Regional Manager. This is a big promotion for him. We first talked to him about this move 6 months ago, but John turned it down. He said you two were going to have kids, and he wanted you to be closer to your family. He also knew that the new position would require a lot more time to work. Then, about 2 months ago, he asked me if the position was still open. He said that the pay raise would allow you to quit your job. He also thought you two might want a change of scenery." Fred stopped and looked at Anne. He added, "John is a great worker, but he's a bad liar. He told me what was really going on between you two. I had hoped you two would move in together, and I'm so sorry it didn't work out. John isn't scheduled to report to the new office until next Monday. I can give you the address and phone number of our branch office there, but I don't know where he's staying in Charleston." Anne stood up and reached for Fred's hand. She said, "Thank you, Mr. Jennings." Fred replied, "Good luck, Anne. We all wish you nothing but the best for the future." The sisters went to lunch at a small diner down the street from her office. As they ate, Anne felt the stares of some of the members of the legal community. She knew there would be a lot of rumors and gossip, but she didn't care now. Anne told her sister, "He gave me every chance, didn't he? He was almost begging me. Why didn't he just say so? Why didn't he ask me to stop? Joan looked at her sister. Did you ever give him any sign that you might stop? They ate and went back to the law office. Deborah Mayton, the best divorce attorney in the firm, was assigned to her case. Deborah read the divorce petition and the proposed property settlement. She looked at Anne and said, "This property division agreement is extremely favorable to you. He leaves you with a house that seems to be almost paid off. In addition, he has only withdrawn $25,000 from your joint investment and bank accounts. You get to keep your 401 account. The arrangement is better, I think, than we could have ever hoped for." Deborah paused to watch Anne's reaction, then continued. "Your husband is asking for the following. He will take the 2 cars he drives, a 1988 BMW 325 IC and a 2018 Toyota RAV4. He will keep his 401 account. It looks like it's a little bigger than yours. He also withdrew $5,000 from your main checking account and all the money from an investment account he called the Baby Fund. That fund has $20,000 in it. The value of your other investment accounts is more. The last item is a request for you to return your maiden name." Joan hugged a sobbing Anne. Deborah Mayton felt a tear roll down her face. She had always liked Anne. She was familiar with her husband, and they seemed so perfect together. Deborah had seen so many failed marriages in recent years. She wondered how anyone could make such a marriage work if these two had failed. She knew it was unprofessional, but went around her desk and hugged Anne. The 3 women cried for lost love. There was nothing to fight about in a divorce. Deborah brought up the destruction of Anne's car, but John's attorney pointed out the unequal division of property. Mayton sought counseling, but the request was denied. John worked out of the area, and those sessions would have been impossible. 45 days later, Anne found herself in a conference room to finalize her divorce proceedings. It was the first time she had seen John since he had left her. He tried to look nice and calm, but he clearly wasn't. With Anne were her parents and Joan. Her parents had insisted on being there, but Anne wasn't sure if they showed up for her or John. Anne and John greeted each other politely and courteously. Anne asked, "John, can we talk privately for a minute?" John nodded and turned to the lawyers. "Can we have a few minutes in one of the conference rooms?" Deborah led the couple down the hall to an empty room. Anne began, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I hurt you. I've been trying to figure out why I cheated on you. The only answer I have is that I was afraid. I was afraid of the changes coming in our lives." John shook his head and said, "And I was excited about the changes coming in our lives. I thought we had the same dreams for our future. Do you remember what we promised each other before we got married?" Anne nodded slowly and answered, "We promised to always talk to each other. We promised that we would never let anything come between us. We promised to always tell each other the truth." Anne said sadly, "I was afraid the children would hurt us, you and me as a couple. I was afraid they would ruin our relationship." John responded sharply, "You thought children would hurt our relationship? You cheated on me with another man to fix our relationship?" John calmed down and continued, "If you had told me your fears, we could have faced them together. The truth is, you didn't want to face change. You did the one thing you knew would end our marriage." Anne said, "You should know that David was never a threat to our marriage." John looked at Anne and replied, "I know he wasn't a threat. You were a threat to our marriage. I'm sorry I couldn't save us from you." She knew he was telling the truth. There was nothing more to say. Anne walked over to John and hugged him. John returned the hug, and the 2 former lovers snuggled together for several minutes. They left the room and went back to their lawyers and family. The papers were signed quickly. As they were about to leave, John turned to Anne and gave her a key and a piece of paper. He said to her, "I have some of your things in the storage room. You need to go there today or tomorrow before your lease expires." John hugged Anne's mom and shook her dad's hand. He promised to visit them as they asked. He hugged Joan and thanked her for being there for Anne. John turned and walked out of Anne's life. Anne wanted to just go home, but her father insisted they go to the warehouse. Her father opened the door, and the 4 of them stared at the contents. There was the Mary, parked there in all its glory. The Miata looked like it had just been waxed. Anne checked the back of the car for the emblem. It was in place. The car had the personal license plates. Anne, Miata. Anne read the note she found on the windshield. Anne, this is the real Mary. The car you found in the garage was an old wreck I found in a junkyard. I wanted you to feel my pain, but I couldn't take Mary away from you. Remember when we made 2 emblems for that car? I hope you two have many more happy days together. Love, John R.S. Mary needs to be insured before you get behind the wheel. Anne's father said, John called me 2 days ago and told me about your car. He wanted to make sure you got it home safely. Anne drove the Miata home. She decided to take a chance and drive 2 miles. She put the Mary in her usual spot in the garage and turned off the ignition. Her family found her crying. They were waiting for her in the living room, but they knew she needed to cry. The funny thing about life is that you often relive an event that you think you can never relive. Anne went on with her life and dove headfirst into her work. A couple years after her divorce, she applied and was accepted to Georgetown Law School. She rarely drove her precious Mary. The joy she had once felt was gone. She preferred to drive the Toyota Corolla she bought after John left. She often talked to her parents. When she asked, they would tell her they were talking to John. Anne wondered if he ever asked about her, and the answer was usually in the negative. The day of the family reunion approached, and Anne spoke to her parents again. Her father asked, "Is it okay if I invite John to the reunion?" She paused and replied, "Dad, it's been almost 5 years. I know how close you two were. I don't mind if you invite him." Her father said, "Even if he brings someone?" Anne closed her eyes and said, "Yes, Dad." At the family reunion, Anne watched John walk into the yard. The last 5 years had been very kind to him. He looked happy. John was accompanied by a pretty woman and 2 children. The children appeared to be between 8 and 12 years old. Anne looked at the woman carefully. She was pretty, tall and slender, with long black hair. Her breasts weren't very big, but she had slender legs. The woman had a good figure, but she seemed to have problems with her postpartum tummy. The 2 new children quickly disappeared into the crowd of other children playing. Anne thought this would be a good time to introduce herself. As she approached the couple, John turned to her. He said, "It's good to see you again, Anne. I'd like to introduce you to my wife, Maria." The pretty woman held out her hand. "Nice to meet you, Anne," she said. Anne replied, "It's nice to meet you, Maria. John and you look good. Who are the 2 little ones that came with you?" Maria replied, "These are our children, William. He is 9 years old, and Serena, she is 11. They were so excited to come today. Neither John nor I have a big family. Thank you for letting us come." John added, "I adopted and fostered them when we got married last year. Their father was killed in Afghanistan a few years ago." Anne smiled and touched John's arm. "I know you've always wanted children. I'm happy for you, for both of you." Maria asked John to go check on the kids and bring her a plate of food. John looked at Anne. "Can I get you something too?" Anne shook her head and sat down next to Maria. Maria said, "I'm sorry to send John away, but I've always wanted to meet you. John has told me so much about you." Maria touched Anne's arm. "He said good things, Anne. He was so in love with you. I was jealous of you for a long time." "And now?" Anne asked. Maria smiled at Anne and answered, "My jealousy turned to anger when he told me how you two broke up. I was angry because you hurt him, but then that was replaced with sadness when I realized the emptiness you left in him. He's the most wonderful man I've ever met, but I know he was once even better. I tried to put all the pieces of the mosaic together." Anne replied, "I'm really sorry. You can't imagine how much I wish I could change what I did, but you seem to have done a great job with it." Maria shook her head. "No work, Anne," she said. "I failed miserably. I tried to help him, but I wasn't the one who saved John. Your father was the greatest help to him. He always treated John as if he were his own son. But the real credit goes to William and Serena. The more time he spent with them, the more he came alive. Children won't let you hide inside yourself." Maria placed Anne's hand on her stomach. "He'll be a wonderful father to our next child," she said, and added before Anne could ask, "I'm 4 months pregnant." Anne hugged Maria. She told her, "I'm so happy you saved him. I never could forgive myself for what I did to him. The realization of what I did haunted me." Anne felt a weight lifted off her shoulders. She had been in therapy for over 4 years, but this one moment seemed to be the cure she had been looking for. Anne looked at Maria and added, I have to tell you, not only did you put his mosaic together, you helped put me together as well. John soon returned with 2 plates of food. Anne's father followed John with the drinks. Anne asked her father, Can you sit with us for a minute? Anne's father replied, Sure. Anne said, There is one item left unresolved in the divorce. I think we need to settle it now. The father looked embarrassed. A half smile seemed to play on Maria's lips. Anne continued, John, we are divorced, but I don't think we've resolved the issue with my family. I think we should have joint custody. You and now Maria and the children are part of that family. Dad laughed, stood up and hugged Anne. Maria cried as she also hugged Anne. John said, Thank you. Anne replied, Don't thank me. You don't know how hard work they can be. At that moment, Anne thought to herself, Well, I may have lost a husband, but I gained a brother. There was a big difference in those kinds of love. Anne chuckled, thinking that Dr. Williams would enjoy talking about this the next time she had a therapy session. 3 days later, Anne thought back to meeting Maria and the kids as she drove to class. The breeze fluttering her hair was wonderful as she moved down the highway. She lowered the convertible top of Mary's car and turned up the radio louder.